Hi Shane, thanks for the video. My name is Richard Stanke. I'm a lecturer at Bryn Mawr College, and in an effort to make macroeconomic theory more fun and interesting, I thought I'd experiment with a YouTube video assignment. Now, I didn't think it was fair for students to do an assignment that I've never done, so here I am giving this YouTube thing a shot. Now, 5,000 takes later, I can appreciate the hard work that goes into making these videos, and also I realized I should have asked for more money in my contract and hired somebody to play this important role. Instead of, I've gone the alternative route, and that's set a very low bar for student videos to hurdle. Hope you guys appreciate that. In any case, I'd like to talk about the trade deficit. I agree with you that it's a very confusing topic, and in my video response I'd like to explain the difference between a good and a bad trade deficit. I'm sorry, trade deficits are not always a good thing. In macroeconomics, economists look at variables like output and unemployment, savings, investments, the trade deficit, and there are others. We look at these variables at the country level. Now, I'd like to look at these same variables only at the individual level. I want to explain the trade deficit at the individual level so you can understand very easily, because you can understand your own individual economic experience, and then argue by analogy that the same relationships must hold true at the country level. So if you can understand the trade deficit at your own personal level, you'll also understand it at the country level. And then you'll also understand what it means for the U.S. to have had a trade deficit since 1976. Even if you're one of these people that say they don't know anything about economics, I think you actually probably know a lot about economics. You're just not familiar with the terminology that economists and journalists use when they write and talk about the economy. And this is not just an empty compliment. I bet you probably work for a living and you have to decide how much to spend and how much to save. These are critical economic decisions, and they're related to your personal trade balance. If your income is higher than your spending, you will have a trade surplus. And the other case, if you spend more than you earn, then you will have a trade deficit. And here's where the excitement comes into the video. No, I'm not talking about an action scene. As you can tell, the action is going to be limited to different camera angles of me sitting and standing in the office. I'm talking about an exciting idea. I want you to think of yourself as an economy in your own right. That's right, it's you against the rest of the world. So when you go to work, what are you doing? You are exporting your labor services. You use the earnings from that work in order to import goods and services. And the key question is it possible for you to import more than you export? Or in other words, is it possible for you personally to run a trade deficit? The answer is yes. You can run a personal trade deficit as long as you're importing more than you're exporting, which, as I've just explained, is equivalent to spending more than you're earning. Now, how can you do that? There's two ways. The first is to run down your savings. Sell the kids' bonds, raid the retirement account. But for those of us not lucky enough to have savings to run down, what do? We borrow. But borrowing has its own costs. We have to pay back everything that we borrow in the future. Not only do we have to pay back the principal, but also the interest. And that's the key problem with borrowing, is that it's a trade-off. We get higher consumption today for lower consumption in the future when we pay back our debt. Now, this might be justified if the borrowing pays for things like education, maybe a new home or a car, things that have payoffs to us in the future. But if the spending is on consumption type spending, meaning items like parties, travel, new clothes, your entourage of friends. What about if you run up $20,000 on your credit card to go gambling in Atlantic City? Then what you've really done is you've dug a big hole for yourself, because sure, you've had a crazy weekend, but that high level of consumption spending today will cost you as you have reduced consumption spending in the future. Now what you've all been waiting for, a look at the U.S. trade balance. Remember, the trade balance is the same as net exports and is equal to exports minus imports. Here I report net exports as a percentage of GDP to keep net exports in proper perspective. This data is from 1959 to 2005 and is from the Economic Report of the President. You can see in the 1960s that the U.S. ran a trade surplus. That trade surplus amounted to about 1% of GDP. Starting in 1976, the U.S. started running a trade deficit. The trade deficit went to about 3% of GDP in the 1980s, which we considered large at that time. That was when we started talking about the twin deficits, that is, the large trade deficit combined with the large budget deficit. But things improved in the early 90s. But recently, the trade deficit has gotten even worse than it was in the 1980s. In fact, in 2005, it went to about 6% of GDP. The region in red represents all the additional debt that we've taken on. This debt again is owed to foreigners, and the problem with this debt is that in the future we may have to lower consumption in order to pay off the debt. So as you can see, it's time for me to go. But I'd like to address one final question, and that is the U.S. trade deficit too large? Now, I'm a good two-handed economist, just like all the rest of them, but I will venture a definitive answer, and that is yes. Just as an individual cannot keep spending more than he or she earns indefinitely, same is true for the U.S. We've been importing more than we've been exporting for over 30 years, and at some point we're going to have to turn around and pay off that debt by running trade surpluses. I think the rest of the world believes this as well, and that's partially responsible for the fall in the value of the dollar that we've been experiencing over the last 5 years. As the value of the dollar falls, exports become cheaper, imports become more expensive, so the falling value of the dollar will help turn around the problem that we have with our trade deficit. Now, I know this doesn't address all the issues related to the trade deficit, but I hope it explains some. I welcome your comments and have a good day.